It was a late October morning in 1975, and the highway in rural Montana was unusually quiet for that time of year. The leaves had turned, heavy with moisture from overnight rain, and the air had a sharp, biting chill. Around 8:15 a.m., two highway workers were checking guardrails along a stretch of back road when something caught their eyes. A figure was emerging from the tree line, slow, staggering, almost invisible against the gray of the forest. The man was barely able to stand. His clothes were torn, his boots caked in mud, and bruises mottled his arms and face. He collapsed onto the roadside shoulder before anyone could reach him. The workers ran over, shouting, but he made no coherent response. He didn't say his name. He didn't explain where he had been or what had happened. Instead, he lay there, shaking, mumbling phrases that made no sense. Words like basement, chain, truck, escaped from cracked lips, followed by silence, then more fragmented murmurs. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man was almost unconscious. His weight had dropped dramatically, his skin pale and clammy, and the rope impressions around his wrists and ankles were deep enough to suggest he had been bound for weeks. EMTs struggled to lift him onto the stretcher. Each movement caused him to flinch violently, as though the mere act of being touched could bring pain back again. Sheriff Tom Hargrove, who had taken the call, recognized the name only after the medics read out the missing persons list from 4 months earlier. The man on the stretcher was Evan Harrell, 29, last seen in early June near the town of Raventon. He had vanished without a trace, and the investigation had long since stalled. Search teams had scoured forests, abandoned cabins, and mining roads for weeks. Families had lost hope. Months had passed, and now, against all odds, Evan was back. But the relief was tempered by immediate concern. He was incoherent, barely able to follow basic instructions. When a deputy tried to ask him what had happened, he flinched and murmured, don't, his voice weak and trembling. Attempts to get him to identify anyone, any location, even himself, were met with only shivering silence and more fragmented, nonsensical phrases. It was clear. Evan had endured something extreme. What exactly, no one could say yet. There were no witnesses, no calls for help, no clues left behind, except the man himself, a human ledger of trauma. The only certainty was the 4-month gap that separated the life he had known from the man who now lay on the roadside. Evan was loaded into the ambulance. On the ride toward the nearest hospital, he drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, he would mumble single words or short fragments, almost like a chant, almost like he was trying to make sense of the reality he had lost. Concrete, footsteps, above me. The medics took note, documenting the phrases carefully. They would later serve as the first and only real clues into what had happened during those 4 months. By the time they arrived at Raventon General Hospital, it was clear that the man in front of them was alive, but not intact. Physically, he was emaciated and weak. Psychologically, he was fragile, to the point that even normal hospital procedures, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, touching his arms, caused him to flinch. And yet, despite the severity of his condition, one thing stood out immediately. He had returned. After 4 months of silence, no clues and no answers, Evan Harrell had come back. What remained unanswered, and what the investigators would spend the next months trying to understand, was everything else. Where he had been, who had him, and what had been done to him. It was a warm, dry morning on June 3, 1975, when Evan Harrell left his family home on the outskirts of Raventon. He had told his mother he would be gone just for a short trip, running errands and checking on a friend's ranch some 20 miles away. A practical, calm man, Evan was known to his neighbors as someone cautious and methodical. He rarely deviated from his routines, and there was nothing to suggest that this day would be different. Around 7:15 a.m., he stopped at McAllister's General Store, a small establishment with peeling paint and a single gas pump out front. A store clerk remembered him distinctly. Evan bought a map of local logging roads, a small pack of trail rations, and a thermos of coffee. The clerk recalled decades later that Evan had seemed focused, checking his compass and folding the map carefully, as if memorizing each turn before leaving the store. By 7:40 a.m., he had returned to his 1967 Chevy Impala, parked in the gravel lot, and drove east toward the county road that led to his friend's ranch. This was the last confirmed sighting for weeks. No one in the area noticed anything unusual. Evan simply disappeared somewhere along that stretch of road. His car would later be found abandoned only 3 miles from the highway at a narrow turnout near the edge of a dense pine forest. The doors were locked. The keys were gone. The engine was cold. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. An empty thermos, a folded map, his pack of trail rations still there. No sign of struggle, no indication he intended to leave voluntarily. At the time, the Raventon Sheriff's Office had few resources. There were no radios in most patrol cars, no interagency communication beyond the county line, and the department relied heavily on volunteer search parties from neighboring ranches. When Evan failed to return by the next day, his parents assumed a minor delay. But by June 7th, when no one had heard from him, they filed a missing person report. The sheriff's office dispatched a small team immediately. Local deputies, 3 volunteer hunters, and a single deputy on horseback began canvassing the area. They combed logging roads, creek beds, and abandoned cabins. The first day yielded almost nothing. Only a single partial footprint, partially washed out by recent rain, suggested someone had walked toward the forest from the roadside turnout. There was also a small piece of torn fabric, which the volunteers assumed could belong to Evan, though no one could be certain. Witness accounts were scarce. A teenage farmhand later recalled seeing a dark-colored pickup truck idling near the back road on the morning of June 3rd, though he had dismissed it at the time. A distant neighbor remembered hearing metal scraping near an old lumber shed late that afternoon. None of these accounts could be verified, but in retrospect, investigators would mark them as the first real threads of evidence. Search parties scoured the region for 2 weeks. They hiked dense pines, crossed shallow streams, and inspected every abandoned hunting cabin in a 10-mile radius. Even a small plane flew low over the forest, the pilot reporting little more than endless green, shadowed valleys and old logging tracks. By the end of the second week, volunteers were exhausted. Frustration grew. There was no trail to follow, no signs of him in the wilderness, no notes, no footprints, nothing. Meanwhile, family and friends began combing every small road and ranch on their own. They left flyers on doors, posted notices in the only local newspaper, and spoke to anyone who might have seen a young man in faded denim and a blue jacket. Most tips were dead ends. Others contradicted each other. One local man claimed to have seen someone resembling Evan walking along a forest track near an abandoned mine. Another insisted he had seen Evan near the creek hours after the first report. Every lead ended in confusion. The forest, wide and unrelenting, swallowed any certainty. And as the days passed, the feeling grew. This was not a case of a man getting lost. Something else had happened. By mid-June, 4 days after Evan Harrell vanished, the search had become a small-scale operation, the kind typical of rural Montana in 1975. The Raventon Sheriff's Office had limited manpower. The department consisted of only 6 deputies, 2 patrol cars, and 1 radio that barely worked beyond a 20-mile radius. They called in every available volunteer, ranchers, hunters, high school boys on summer break, and members of the local fire department. Some rode horses, others trudged through dense forest on foot, and one volunteer even flew a small Cessna 150 over the area, circling low in the hope of spotting footprints, tire tracks, or disturbed foliage. The area itself was formidable. A mixture of rolling hills, dense lodgepole pine forests, and abandoned mining roads created a labyrinth impossible to survey in full. Narrow gullies cut deep into the landscape. Creeks ran sluggishly through the valleys, often obscured by thick underbrush. Old hunting cabins, some abandoned for decades, dotted the area, their roofs collapsing, their windows dark and hollow. Every step into the wilderness felt like stepping back in time, the silence only broken by crows, distant cows, or the occasional hum of an old logging truck. Day 1. The initial sweep concentrated near Evan's abandoned Impala, parked along the gravel turnout 3 miles from the main highway. Deputies cataloged every inch of ground. Volunteer searchers scoured the forest perimeter. 2 key items were found. A partial footprint heading toward a densely forested ridge. The print was indistinct, partially washed out by rain, but it confirmed that Evan or someone had moved into the trees. A small scrap of fabric faded blue denim caught on a branch. Volunteers assumed it belonged to Evan's jacket, though no one could confirm. Beyond that, there was nothing. The forest swallowed any certainty. Day 2. Search parties moved farther into the ridges. The sheriff divided volunteers into smaller groups, each with a specific sector: North Ridge, Creek Valley, abandoned cabins, logging roads. The horseback searchers reported areas impassable on foot. Old mine shafts were inspected but found empty. The Cessna pilots circled repeatedly, reporting only endless green shadows, the remnants of old logging trails, and broken fence lines. One older hunter remembered seeing someone near an abandoned homestead weeks before, someone who fit Evan's description. But the location was 15 miles away from the car, impossible to reach quickly on foot. It raised uncomfortable questions. Was Evan ever walking freely, or had he been moved? Day 3. A rainstorm soaked the area, washing away footprints and making any soil disturbances almost invisible. Volunteers found a small campfire pit, no larger than 2 feet in diameter, with traces of charred wood and remnants of dried leaves. Nothing else. It suggested someone had stayed there briefly, but whether it was Evan or another person, they could not tell. Meanwhile, deputies began documenting human leads. A teenage farmhand reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck along a back road. He was certain of the license plate's last 3 digits, but the vehicle could not be traced. A logger remembered metal clanging near an abandoned lumber shed echoing through the hills. A neighbor mentioned hearing a muffled scream late at night, though he assumed it was a hunting dog in distress. Every lead conflicted, every detail frustratingly ambiguous. The volunteers often argued among themselves, some insisting Evan had wandered too far, others convinced he had been taken. The forest offered no answers. Day 4. Search parties started encountering natural obstacles that slowed progress dramatically. Dense underbrush and fallen trees made a straight path impossible. Narrow gullies filled with water created natural barriers. Steep slopes forced horses to detour miles around. By evening, the sheriff gathered everyone at a cleared logging road. Volunteers were exhausted, muddy, and demoralized. Reports had been filed, maps updated, but no trace of Evan had been found beyond the footprint and the fabric scrap. It was at this point that a subtle realization began to take hold. Evan Harrell had not simply gotten lost in the wilderness. The scattered fragments, the sightings, the truck, the fire pit, the metal clanging, suggested he had been somewhere else, perhaps somewhere controlled, somewhere human hands intervened. And yet, at that moment, no one could know how far from human eyes he had been, or what had happened in the days after he vanished. By the end of June 1975, 3 weeks had passed since Evan Harrell disappeared. The forested hills and abandoned logging roads had been combed repeatedly, but no new evidence had surfaced. Search parties dwindled as volunteers returned to their daily lives, leaving only a skeleton crew of deputies to patrol the area. The once bustling roadside turnout where Evan's car had been found now seemed eerily quiet, a small monument to uncertainty. The sheriff's office logged daily updates, each entry more frustrating than the last. Footprints had vanished after rainfall. Tire tracks led nowhere. Abandoned cabins were empty, with only the occasional scrap of wood or rusted tool to suggest human presence. In the files, deputies noted repeated patterns. Evan was careful, methodical, resourceful. He could not have vanished by accident. Meanwhile, the family felt the passage of time like a weight. Evan's mother, Martha Harrell, spent long hours combing back roads, leaving flyers pinned to every telephone pole. She called neighboring towns, visited local ranches, and questioned anyone who might have passed through the area in early June. Her husband, Frank Harrell, spent nights walking the logging roads with a flashlight, scanning every shadow, listening for any unusual sound. Even Evan's younger brother, Peter, joined in the search. Armed with a rifle for protection against wildlife, he mapped abandoned trails and fenced-in pastures, checking each one meticulously. Sometimes he would stumble upon old campsites, collapsed tents, rusted cans, but none contained evidence of his brother. Local rumors began to circulate. Hunters spoke in hushed tones about strangers in the woods, drifters passing through under cover of darkness. One elderly rancher mentioned seeing a dark pickup truck idling near a disused mill road days after Evan disappeared. Teenagers reported hearing muffled screams during night hikes, though adults dismissed them as the wind, coyotes, or imagination. By mid-July, 4 weeks after Evan vanished, the search officially slowed. The county deputies had exhausted their resources, and the terrain made a thorough sweep nearly impossible. Horses could not traverse certain ravines. Streams, swollen from early summer rains, cut off access to large sections of forest. The small Cessna used for aerial reconnaissance had been grounded due to mechanical issues, leaving no way to cover the vast patchwork terrain efficiently. The local press, initially attentive, began to lose interest. Headlines dwindled from "Young Man Missing in Raventon" to "Search Continues in Montana Backwoods," and eventually disappeared entirely. What remained was a growing silence, a collective shrug from the outside world, and a family slowly realizing that their son had been taken into a place they could not reach. By August, the area had taken on a sense of foreboding. Even experienced hunters avoided the ridges near the forest edge, the abandoned. Cabins that once seemed harmless were now described as creepy or unnerving. The roads that cut through the hills were narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees that seemed to swallow sound. And everywhere, the persistent thought lingered. Evan Harrell had not simply wandered off. Someone or something had made sure he did not return. As the months passed, investigators reviewed every detail they could. The truck sighting, untraceable. Reports of screams, inconclusive. The scrap of denim, cataloged but unanalyzable with 1975 forensics. The campfire pit, its ashes long gone. All of it suggested a presence, human, deliberate, organized. And yet, there was nothing solid, nothing to locate. The forest remained quiet. The ridges and gullies stretched endlessly, hiding secrets. In the minds of the few deputies still involved, one thought began to take root. Evan had been somewhere controlled, somewhere someone else had dictated every step of his existence. The months stretched into late September. The once active search was reduced to periodic patrols, notes filed away, and the slow erosion of hope. It was during this quiet that the first whispers among the locals started, that some men had been seen moving heavy equipment at night, that strange lights flickered in the old abandoned mill, that the forest itself seemed too silent, too calculated. No one knew at the time how prophetic those whispers would be. They were echoes of something unseen, something deliberate. And as the leaves began to turn and fall that autumn, Evan Harrell's story had already entered the space where most disappearances die, the forgotten files of a small sheriff's office, the fading memories of those who searched, and the long, empty roads of Montana. When Evan Harrell arrived at Raventon General Hospital in late October 1975, the attending staff were unprepared for what they found. EMTs reported that he had been brought in semi-conscious, his body covered in bruises, abrasions, and deep rope impressions on both wrists and ankles. At first glance, he appeared emaciated, weighing far less than he should for a man of 29. His hair and beard were matted, his skin pale, and his hands swollen and raw from prolonged restraint. The triage nurse, Clara Jensen, recalled the scene decades later. "I had never seen a patient like that. Every movement made him flinch, almost as if the air itself could strike him. He barely spoke. If he did, it was fragments, words, not sentences, like a recording stuck in his head." The doctors noted 3 primary indicators of his condition: severe dehydration, his lips cracked, his eyes sunken, veins barely visible beneath paper-thin skin; critical malnutrition, long-term insufficient caloric intake evident from muscle wasting and low body weight; psychological trauma, hypervigilance, flinching, avoidance of touch, and an inability to speak coherently. Early assessments suggested he had been restrained and isolated for weeks, possibly months, with minimal access to food, water, or sunlight. Bruises of differing ages indicated repeated beatings. Rope marks on his wrists and ankles were deeply embedded, suggesting long-term confinement. The pattern of injuries made it clear he had not wandered off. He had been held against his will. Evan did not communicate normally. When nurses attempted to speak to him, he would flinch, clutch his shoulders, and mutter fragments of words: basement, cold, chains, concrete, truck, footsteps above. He repeated these phrases obsessively, whispering them as if they were the only reality he could access. Medical staff quickly realized that any direct questioning or physical touch could trigger panic, and each session required extreme caution. Psychologists were called in. Dr. Harold Whitman, the county's senior clinical psychologist, described his behavior as exhausted automaticity. Evan had developed repetitive compulsive speech patterns and remained hyper-aware of anyone around him. He exhibited signs of prolonged coercion, likely punished for any perceived mistake, which had caused his brain to adopt these repeated phrases as a survival mechanism. Over the first week, Evan's physical condition improved slightly with IV fluids and nutritional support, but his psychological state remained fragile. He sat on a hospital bed, often rocking slightly, muttering incoherent phrases under his breath. He would not meet the eyes of staff or family members. Simple gestures, placing a blanket over him, adjusting a pillow, could trigger panic. Nurses reported one particularly haunting behavior. When left alone for even a few minutes, he would whisper or mutter these phrases continuously, almost rhythmically, as though maintaining a fragile connection to a reality that had been brutally stripped from him. Family members were allowed to visit. His mother, Martha, described it as like he was here but not here, like he had been replaced by a shadow of himself. She attempted to ask him where he had been, what had happened, but received only fragments of speech and occasional fearful flinches. By the end of his first week, doctors were certain of one grim reality. Evan had survived months of extreme abuse, but his mind had adopted a survival-driven repetitive state, unable to process coherent memory or narrative. His return was miraculous, but his rescue was only the beginning of understanding the horrors he had endured. Every word he muttered, broken and fragmented, would later serve as the first real clue into the dark reality of his captivity. Fragments of information that the investigators would painstakingly reconstruct to understand what had truly happened during those 4 months. By the second week of his hospitalization, Evan Harrell had regained enough strength to sit upright, though barely. His body was fragile, every movement was tentative. Yet it was his mind that concerned the medical team the most. He spoke, if it could be called speaking, only in fragments, whispered over and over, almost mechanically. Nurses documented his phrases with meticulous care. Basement, concrete, dark, chains, footsteps, above me, truck, keys, don't make noise. Each phrase was repeated dozens of times, in the same tone at the same pace, as if he were reciting a mantra drilled into him. No sentence structure, no explanation, no context, only fragments. Dr. Harold Whitman, the county psychologist, observed that Evan displayed what he called hyper-conditioned survival responses. He explained, "This is typical of someone subjected to prolonged captivity and control. The mind adopts a single, repetitive behavior to cope. Every phrase, every whispered repetition is a survival mechanism. He has learned that saying these words may prevent further harm, even months after the trauma ended." Even attempts by family members to speak to him provoked panic. A simple touch on his shoulder caused him to flinch violently, clutching himself, whispering the same phrases faster, almost stammering. Each visit was an exercise in patience. Nurses and doctors had to coordinate with each other, ensuring no sudden movement, no direct gaze, no loud sounds. During one observation session, Evan's mother tried to ask a simple question, hoping to elicit a memory. "Evan, can you tell me where you were?" He flinched, rocked slightly, and whispered repeatedly, Don't, basement, concrete, no names, no locations, only fear encoded in fragments." Meanwhile, investigators began to treat the fragments as clues. Sheriff Hargrove met with Dr. Whitman and hospital staff, reviewing the documentation of phrases. They began mapping the words, basement and concrete, suggested an indoor, possibly industrial or storage location. Chains indicated restraint, likely mechanical or improvised. Truck and keys hinted at transportation, possibly suggesting he had been moved. Footsteps above implied multiple captors, someone monitoring him. Even these fragments, though incoherent, provided the first real window into what had happened to Evan during the 4 months of his disappearance. As the hospital days continued, Evan remained in this fragile state. He never regained coherent speech, and his repetitive phrases became a near-constant soundtrack for those observing him. The staff noted that he sometimes paused mid-phrase, staring at the ceiling as though listening to something invisible, then continued, almost ritualistically, whispering the same sequence again. It was clear to everyone involved this man had been controlled, brutalized, and conditioned to survive in silence. His return was miraculous, but understanding what had happened and who had done it would take months of patient investigation, careful cross-referencing, and interpretation of these fractured statements. The whispers, the broken words, and the compulsive repetition were not just signs of trauma. They were keys to unraveling the mystery of Evan Harrell's captivity. By late October 1975, 4 months after Evan Harrell disappeared, the small team of investigators was working quietly but methodically. Sheriff Tom Hargrove and his deputies, alongside Dr. Whitman and hospital staff, began analyzing Evan's repeated phrases as potential clues rather than simply symptoms of trauma. Every fragment he whispered was recorded, time-stamped, and mapped. Investigators noticed patterns in the fragments: basement, concrete, chains, footsteps above, truck, keys, don't make noise. Each word was considered a possible reference to locations, objects, or actions. Deputies plotted them against abandoned structures, industrial sites, and isolated cabins within a 20-mile radius of Raventon. One lead came from the phrase, basement ou concrete. At first, it seemed improbable in Montana's rural hills, where most buildings were single-story and wood-framed, but a volunteer recalled an old abandoned cold storage facility left unused since the early 1960s, with a concrete basement reinforced with steel beams. It was isolated, accessible only by a narrow dirt road hidden behind a stand of pines. Another clue emerged from truck keys. Investigators searched local registries for unusual vehicle sightings around June, cross-referencing with the minor truck report from a teenage farmhand. Though incomplete, the partial license plate led to a small private contractor who occasionally used trucks for moving equipment. By combining the fragments, deputies began to construct a timeline of captivity. Initial abduction near the roadside turnout, June 3, 1975. Transported via truck, indicated by repeated mentions of keys and truck. Imprisonment in a basement or enclosed concrete structure, supported by basement in concrete fragments, monitored by multiple captors, suggested by footsteps above. Repeated restraints and conditioning, implied by chains in his compulsive repetition. Investigators also noted that some phrases occurred more frequently at certain times of day. Hospital staff documented a subtle rhythm. Mornings were quieter, afternoons were when the phrases became more insistent. Dr. Whitman hypothesized this reflected the schedule of his captors, suggesting routine, discipline, and control that had ingrained itself in Evan's psyche. Deputy Frank Collins, assigned to track potential locations, described the painstaking work. We were literally following fragments of speech, using words he barely whispered to us as a map. Every old cabin, every abandoned facility, every dirt track became a possible site. It was slow, exhausting work, but we had to believe the fragments meant something. Meanwhile, family and friends tried to provide support. Martha Harrell visited daily, reading aloud from newspapers and old letters, attempting to anchor her son in familiar reality. Evan sometimes reacted, slowing the repetition of his phrases when her voice was nearby, as if recognizing safety without fully understanding it. After weeks of mapping and field visits, deputies identified 3 primary locations that fit the fragments. Each was remote, obscured by hills or forest, and difficult to access without vehicles. The investigators knew that any direct search might be dangerous, as the captors could have been armed or still nearby. By November 1975, the case had entered a delicate phase. Evan Harrell was speaking in fragments, but investigators were finally starting to decode them. The words that had once been incomprehensible whispers were now tools for reconstructing his captivity, providing the first real leads after 4 months of silence. It was slow work, methodical and painstaking, but for the first time since June, there was a glimmer of hope. The forest and the abandoned structures were no longer just empty spaces. They were potential evidence of what had happened to him. By mid-November 1975, investigators had been mapping Evan's phrases for weeks. Every fragment, basement, concrete, chains, footsteps above, truck, keys, was cross-referenced with the local geography, abandoned buildings, and old industrial sites. The work was painstaking, and progress was slow, but it finally paid off. On November 14th, deputies Frank Collins and Jerry Whitaker, accompanied by 2 volunteers familiar with the back roads, arrived at the old cold storage facility identified weeks earlier. The building was nearly invisible from the main road, hidden behind dense pines, with a collapsed fence and weeds overtaking the entrance. The cold, gray concrete of the structure matched the fragments Evan had whispered for weeks. As they approached cautiously, a faint metallic smell caught their attention, Collins recalled later. It was faint, almost like rust and old blood mixed. We didn't know what we'd find, but there was something felt off. Inside, the basement was dark, damp, and cramped. The concrete floor was cracked and rusted shelving lined the walls. What first drew their attention were the chains. 2 heavy chains anchored into the wall, worn from repeated use. The floor below them scuffed with marks as if someone had struggled. The deputies realized immediately that this was consistent with Evan's descriptions. Nearby, an old mattress lay stained and tattered, its padding flattened over years of use. On it were faint rope impressions and fragments of clothing. A thermos, corroded but recognizable, matched the one he had carried when he disappeared. Each item, each detail, resonated with Evan's repeated phrases, turning fragmented whispers into a real location. It became clear. This was where he had been confined, at least for part of the 4 months. Deputies moved carefully, documenting everything. They found chains and rope marks embedded in the concrete floor, fragments of denim clothing matching Evan's jacket, small, empty containers of food and water, suggesting someone had provided minimal sustenance, deep scratches and scuff marks consistent with someone struggling to escape. Despite the evidence, there were no signs of captors. The place had been abandoned long before the deputies arrived, likely weeks earlier. Whoever had held Evan had left him here or moved him elsewhere, but not without leaving traces that now confirmed his whispers. Back at the hospital, investigators began cross-referencing the physical evidence with Evan's phrases. Dr. Whitman noted, "The words he repeated, basement concrete chains, weren't random. They were anchors in his memory, fragments of an experience so extreme that they had lodged themselves into the most basic part of his brain. Each word was a breadcrumb, leading us closer to understanding what had been done to him. For the first time, there was tangible proof of the horrors implied by his delirious statements. The investigators could now move forward, focusing on the physical locations, potential captors, and the timeline of his captivity. Though the facility offered the first real confirmation, the case remained far from solved. 4 months of disappearance, months of silence, and now a small, grim discovery. The truth was beginning to take shape, but the story was far from over. By late November 1975, investigators had confirmed the first tangible evidence of Evan Harrell's captivity. The abandoned cold storage basement provided physical proof that the fragments he whispered for months were grounded in reality. But confirming the location was only the beginning. Now, the deputies faced the far more difficult task, identifying and locating the people responsible. The team worked in multiple directions. Sheriff Tom Hargrove divided responsibilities. Deputies would canvass local towns, check records of transient workers, and interview residents, while Dr. Whitman and hospital staff cataloged every fragment of Evan's statements for possible leads. One line of investigation came from the truck Evan repeatedly mentioned. Investigators revisited the report from the teenage farmhand who had seen a dark-colored truck near the back roads in June. Partial license plate numbers were recorded, a 3-digit fragment that seemed meaningless at first, but local mechanics and ranchers remembered a truck matching the description, often seen hauling equipment to remote sites. Cross-referencing vehicle sightings, deputies discovered a pattern of deliveries to abandoned industrial sites and rural properties. The names connected to these trucks were men with past minor offenses, trespassing, theft, and suspicion of illegal work in remote areas. While none had a direct criminal record for abduction, the pattern suggested preparation and familiarity with isolated locations. Meanwhile, the fragments, footsteps above, and chains provided a psychological map. Investigators realized that Evan had been closely monitored and restrained systematically. This indicated multiple captors working together, someone organized enough to keep a man isolated for months without detection. A breakthrough came when a local hunter remembered seeing a light at night inside a supposedly abandoned cabin several miles from the cold storage site. The hunter had dismissed it as a passing vehicle months earlier, but investigators now saw it as a potential second site of confinement. Deputies moved carefully, mapping the surrounding area, noting that every road, creek, and hill could be used as a covert approach. Forensic teams also analyzed the chains, ropes, and clothing remnants from the basement. Although 1975 lacked modern DNA testing, careful pattern and wear analysis indicated repeated use by the same captor relentless. The type of rope, fraying patterns, and placement suggested someone methodical and experienced with restraining humans for extended periods. Family interviews provided additional context. Evan's mother, Martha, described him whispering names and brief descriptors of people he could barely recall: man, tall, hat, voice, deep, keys. These fragments were cataloged as potential suspect descriptors. Although incomplete, they offered a psychological sketch of the captors, deliberate, controlling, familiar, with remote properties and capable of intimidation without direct confrontation. By December 1975, investigators had a working profile. Multiple captors, suggested by repeated phrases about surveillance, knowledge of remote properties, confirmed by trucks and abandoned facilities, methodical restraint techniques, evidenced by chains, rope patterns, and confinement locations, long-term manipulation and control, implied by Evan's mental state and obsessive repetition. The team was cautious but optimistic. For the first time since June, they had a coherent path forward. The fragments of Evan's whispers were no longer meaningless. They were a map, a trail of breadcrumbs left in his traumatized memory. But even with this progress, challenges remained. Remote locations, months-old evidence, and the captor's apparent foresight meant that any misstep could erase critical clues. The investigators knew that patience, methodical work, and careful coordination would be essential if they hoped to finally confront the men responsible and reconstruct what had truly happened during Evan's 4 months of captivity. By early December 1975, investigators had begun the painstaking work of reconstructing Evan Harrell's 4-month captivity. The fragments of his whispers, the physical evidence in the abandoned cold storage basement, and reports from locals were slowly forming a coherent timeline. Every small detail mattered. Every repeated phrase became a clue to understanding the ordeal. The investigators worked systematically. Dr. Whitman spent hours reviewing hospital logs and nurses' notes, cataloging when Evan whispered certain words or reacted to stimuli. Sheriff Hargrove and his deputies reviewed maps of abandoned buildings, logging roads, and rural properties. Each fragment of Evan's speech was cross-referenced with potential locations. From this, the team identified a pattern of captivity. Initial abduction, early June 1975. Evan was likely taken near the roadside turnout where his Impala was found. Witnesses had seen a dark-colored truck, and the partial license plate suggested the captors were premeditated and familiar with remote routes. Transport and initial confinement, repeated mentions of truck and keys, indicated that Evan had been moved multiple times, probably to prevent discovery. Investigators suspected at least 2 different confinement sites, the cold storage basement and a remote cabin several miles away. Daily routine of captivity, the phrases chains, footsteps above, suggested he was closely monitored. Captors imposed strict schedules, allowing minimal movement and providing only enough food and water to survive. Patterns in Evan's whispers, more frequent repetition at certain hours, hinted that he had learned to anticipate when he would be observed or punished. Physical and psychological torment, rope and chain marks in the basement revealed that restraints were not just for confinement, they were a method of control, creating hyper-awareness and compliance. Evan's obsessive repetition of fragmented phrases became a conditioned response, a mental strategy to survive. Investigators cross-referenced local reports with this emerging timeline. Hunters reported lights in abandoned cabins at night, while ranchers mentioned unusual truck traffic along dirt roads. One teenager remembered seeing a man loading equipment into a truck, possibly the same vehicle described months earlier. Dr. Whitman emphasized the psychological significance of the timeline. The sequence of captivity, observation, and minimal sustenance is consistent with extreme control. The phrases Evan repeats are more than memories, they're survival strategies. They encode time, place, and method, allowing him to navigate trauma without full awareness. By December, deputies had mapped a sequence of likely movements. Week 1-2, abduction and initial confinement in a temporary location near the turnout. Week 3-6, transfer to the cold storage basement, chains and minimal sustenance imposed. Week 7 or 16, movement between the basement and a secondary remote cabin, each shift reinforcing control and dependence on captors. Family members, observing Evan in the hospital, noticed subtle changes. When asked about locations or names, he would pause, then whisper a fragment, often pointing vaguely toward the northwest or tilting his head toward the floor. These gestures, combined with the phrases, helped investigators pinpoint exact structures and pathways he had been forced to navigate. By mid-December, the timeline was no longer just a series of guesses. It was a reconstructed map of control, fear, and survival, detailing how captors maintained dominance and how Evan's mind adapted to endure 4 months of confinement. The timeline became the foundation for the next phase, investigators moving into the field to confront the sites and the captors themselves. By late December 1975, investigators had reconstructed a working timeline of Evan Harrell's captivity. Now the task was to revisit the physical sites, to turn whispers and fragments into tangible evidence. Sheriff Tom Hargrove organized a small, methodical field team. 2 deputies, a forensic photographer, and 2 volunteers familiar with the back roads and abandoned properties. The first site was the abandoned cold storage basement. It had been photographed and logged months earlier, but now investigators approached with a new perspective informed by Evan's timeline and statements. The interior was quiet, almost impossibly so. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the team's careful footsteps. Every mark on the concrete floor, every rusted chain, every scrap of tattered clothing was examined. Investigators noticed reinforced chains anchored into concrete walls showing repeated use, scratches on the floor and wall corners, consistent with struggles or attempts to free oneself. Small depressions in the floor, possibly indicating where food or water had been left. Deputy Frank Collins recalled, "Walking through that basement, it was like you could feel the weight of someone having been there, trapped. The chains, the scratches, they weren't random. They were a record of fear and survival." From there, the team moved to the secondary remote cabin, miles northwest of the basement. This structure matched several of Evan's whispered fragments. Footsteps above, "Don't make noise." The cabin had a small loft and a trap door leading to the ground level. Inside, investigators found evidence of recent occupancy, footprints in the dust, partially rotted blankets, and remnants of food wrappers matching the type Evan had described in his hospital statements. Rope fibers and tie-down marks on the floor beams, consistent with temporary restraints. Rusted tools and a lantern, indicating someone had been using the cabin as a controlled environment for captivity. One particularly chilling discovery was a metal key on the floor, bent but identifiable. It matched the partial description from Evan's repeated word, keys. While it could not definitively identify the captor, it suggested organized confinement and a degree of premeditation. Field notes cross-referenced with Evan's hospital statements revealed patterns. The basement was primary confinement, while the cabin served as secondary monitoring, possibly for short-term relocation or isolation. The repetitive control, limited sustenance, and constant threat of observation were confirmed by the tangible marks in both locations. Dr. Whitman, present on site, remarked on the psychological impact. "Walking through these spaces, you can see how systematic the abuse was. These aren't random acts. This is control over mind, body, and environment. Evan's whispers aren't just memories, they're precise reflections of the methods used against him." By the end of the day, investigators had collected rope and chain samples for further analysis, fibers and debris linking both sites, photographic evidence of struggle and placement of restraints. The revisited sites provided the first direct connection between Evan's fragmented statements and the physical world. They confirmed not only that he had been held for months, but also that the captors were methodical, deliberate, and experienced in controlling a human being for extended periods. As the team left the forest that evening, Sheriff Hargrove noted, "For months, all we had were whispers and fragments. Now we have walls, chains, keys, and footprints. For the first time, we're moving from reconstruction to confrontation." The next step would be to trace these clues to the captors themselves, a challenge that would require meticulous detective work, interviews, and follow-up on every fragment, every whisper, every piece of evidence left behind. By early January 1976, investigators had collected months of fragmented evidence. Evan Harrell's whispered phrases, physical traces at the cold storage basement and remote cabin, rope fibers, footprints, and a bent key. What remained was the most critical step, linking the physical evidence to the people responsible. Sheriff Tom Hargrove convened a small task force, combining deputies with local volunteers and Dr. Harold Whitman. Every fragment of Evan's speech was revisited. Phrases like truck, keys, footsteps above became central clues in the hunt for captors. Investigators also examined vehicle records in neighboring counties, focusing on trucks matching descriptions from June. A breakthrough came when Deputy Frank Collins cross-referenced mechanic records with sightings of trucks hauling equipment to remote, abandoned industrial properties. One name repeatedly appeared, Leonard Kessler, a local contractor known for maintaining and hauling supplies to old storage sites. Kessler had a reputation for keeping quiet about his activities, which included nighttime trips and temporary work in isolated locations. Further investigation into Kessler's associates revealed two men who frequently accompanied him on these trips, both with minor criminal records, one for trespassing, another for illegal hunting. Together, they fit the profile implied by Evan's whispers: multiple captors, methodical, familiar with remote terrain, and capable of controlling someone without detection. The task force decided to interview neighbors and local townspeople, probing for unusual activity in June through October 1975. Several recalled strange late-night truck activity consistent with Evan's repeated reference to truck and keys. One rancher remembered a dark truck parked near a rarely used back road, and another reported seeing men carrying large bundles into a remote building, possibly the basement Evan described. Simultaneously, Dr. Whitman analyzed Evan's behavior for psychological consistency. He noted, every fragment he repeated, basement, chains, truck, footsteps, matches the locations and patterns of the suspects we're identifying. His conditioned survival phrases are now functioning as a blueprint to reconstruct the captivity and trace the perpetrators. Investigators began cross-referencing the physical evidence with suspect movements. The bent key found in the cabin matched the type of padlock used on Kessler's equipment storage. Rope fibers were consistent with supplies Kessler and his associates were known to carry for industrial work. Even footprints from the basement matched shoe patterns registered in local stores to the same men. By mid-January, the pieces of the puzzle were aligning. The team compiled a list of primary suspects: Leonard Kessler, contractor, primary operator, known for isolated site work; James Harlow, associate, minor criminal record, trespassing; Tommy Devereaux, associate, experienced in remote terrain, previously observed hauling materials at night. With physical evidence, witness reports, and cross-referenced vehicle and activity records, investigators had moved from reconstruction to actionable leads. They now had a clear plan: surveillance, follow-up interviews, and coordinated arrests once sufficient evidence had been compiled. For the first time since Evan Harrell's abduction in June, there was a real path to justice. Months of silence, whispers, and fragmented phrases were finally transforming into a coherent investigative direction, and the captor's carefully maintained secrecy was beginning to unravel. By early February 1976, investigators were ready. Months of painstaking work, analyzing Evan Harrell's fragmented statements, retracing the routes of trucks, examining abandoned sites, and collecting physical evidence, had produced a clear suspect list. Sheriff Tom Hargrove coordinated a small, discreet operation to apprehend Leonard Kessler and his two associates, James Harlow and Tommy Devereaux. The operation was conducted with precision. Surveillance teams observed the suspects' routines for several days, confirming their patterns of travel and the locations they frequented. Kessler, the primary operator, was seen driving the dark truck repeatedly to remote storage cabins and industrial ruins, matching the movements Evan had described in his whispers: truck, keys, footsteps above. On February 10th, deputies moved in. Hargrove recalled, "We approached carefully. These men were familiar with isolated terrain. Any misstep could alert them and risk destroying months of evidence. But we had to act. Evan's testimony, his whispers, his phrases, had guided us this far. It was time to close the circle." The arrests were swift. Kessler was apprehended at a remote cabin, surprised but compliant. Harlow and Devereaux were taken near their usual work sites, both visibly startled by the presence of law enforcement. Each suspect was transported to the Raventon Sheriff's Office for interrogation. During questioning, the psychological impact of Evan's ordeal became evident. Investigators noticed that the captors had attempted to erase evidence meticulously, but the traces remained. Chains, rope marks, disturbed floors, footprints, and discarded containers all corroborated Evan's fragmented descriptions. Interrogators focused on the timeline established from Evan's phrases: abduction near the roadside turnout in early June 1975, initial confinement in temporary locations, transfer to the cold storage basement, secondary confinement at a remote cabin, repeated use of restraints and monitoring. Faced with this timeline, Kessler's initial denials began to falter. Cross-referenced with vehicle sightings, the bent key, rope fibers, and footprints, the evidence created an airtight narrative. Harlow and Devereaux also eventually broke under pressure, confirming Kessler's control and methodical execution of the captivity plan. Dr. Whitman observed the interrogation process carefully, noting how the psychological trauma Evan had endured reflected in the suspects' accounts. Each admission matched a fragment Evan had whispered for months. The chains, the concrete basement, the trucks, the footsteps above, all had been observed, recorded, and remembered by a traumatized mind, now verified by investigative work. By the end of February, all three men were formally charged with abduction, unlawful confinement, and assault. For the first time since June 1975, there was a sense of closure, at least in terms of justice in the legal sense. Evan, still recovering in the hospital, was informed of the arrests in a gentle, monitored session. He did not speak at first, but the hospital staff noted a subtle change. His repetitive phrases slowed, a slight easing in the tension of his shoulders. While the trauma remained, there was a glimmer of recognition. The danger was over. The captors were no longer free. The investigation had followed a singular path, from fragmented whispers and incoherent phrases to physical evidence and finally to the suspects themselves. Months of silence, terror, and survival had been transformed into a coherent narrative, allowing law enforcement to act decisively. By March 1976, Evan Harrell was finally free from the immediate danger of his captors. Physically, he was fragile. Severe malnutrition, muscle atrophy, and rope abrasions marked his body, each a reminder of months spent in captivity. Psychologically, he remained tethered to the trauma, repeating fragments of phrases he had whispered for survival: basement, chains, footsteps above. Hospital staff developed a slow, deliberate plan for both physical and mental recovery. Dr. Harold Whitman led the psychological efforts, introducing short, controlled sessions aimed at reconnecting Evan with reality without triggering panic. Each session was a delicate balance. Any sudden question or touch could provoke flinches or obsessive repetition. Evan's mother, Martha, visited daily. Her presence became an anchor in the chaos of his fragmented memory. Even small interactions, a hand on his shoulder, a quiet conversation about ordinary events, were milestones. While Evan could not yet articulate his experience in full sentences, his body language began to show signs of trust, subtle easing in posture, fewer flinches, and slower repetition of survival phrases. Dr. Whitman explained to investigators, Evan's repetition was a conditioned survival response. It protected him for 4 months. Now, the challenge is to allow him to rebuild trust, to relearn that not every shadow, every footstep, every noise is a threat. Meanwhile, law enforcement focused on solidifying the legal case against Leonard Kessler, James Harlow, and Tommy Devereaux. Every fragment Evan had whispered now served as corroborative evidence: the chains, the basement, the trucks, the keys. Witnesses, forensic evidence, and his statements combined into a clear narrative of systematic captivity. The community, still shaken by the abduction, followed developments closely. Local newspapers recounted the remarkable survival of Evan Harrell, emphasizing the combination of investigative persistence and his own mental resilience. Dr. Whitman noted the significance of the whispers. Evan's brain recorded the events in fragments. Those fragments were his way of surviving. They were the breadcrumbs that led us to the captors and ultimately to his liberation. Evan's road to recovery remained long. Physical therapy restored strength, while carefully guided therapy sessions helped him reclaim control over his environment and his memory. Months of captivity had instilled a deep sense of hypervigilance, but incremental successes, sleeping without restraints, walking outside, speaking complete sentences, signaled that healing was possible. For investigators, the case became an example of meticulous police work. Months of tracking, analysis, and cross-referencing fragments of speech had transformed Evan's whispered words into actionable leads. Sheriff Hargrove summarized the investigation's significance. Without Evan's phrases, we would never have located the 8 confinement sites. Every whispered word repeated hundreds of times was a guide through the darkness. It was extraordinary and deeply humbling. As spring approached in 1976, Evan Harrell remained in the hospital under careful supervision. His recovery was ongoing, but the shadow of his captivity had been pierced. The captors were behind bars, the evidence preserved, and the truth reconstructed from the fragments of a traumatized mind. In the quiet moments, as he stared out of hospital windows toward the slowly thawing fields, Evan whispered his fragments less often. The phrases were no longer only a lifeline, they were a testament to survival and resilience, a record of endurance in the face of months-long captivity.
Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next videos, where we continue to follow the mysteries that have never slept. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned.